Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 2 of the Club podcast. Each week, we bring you long-form conversations with the people building at the edges of crypto and community. At Seed Club, we believe in a world where people, not platforms, capture the value created online, and where community-owned networks are some of the most valuable organizations in the world. Join us for a front row seat to the latest insights and tactical learnings at the intersection of crypto and community. Before we get to today's guest, I need to let you know that applications for Seed Club's 5th cohort, that's SC05, kick off on August 1st. That's less than a week away. Oh my God. No, more than a week. It's very, very soon. So if you're thinking about building a DAO, a tokenized community, a guild, a collective, anything that's exploring the intersection of tokens and community-owned networks, we want to hear from you. Make sure you head on over to seedclub.xyz or see the pinned tweet on our Twitter account at seedclubhq for more information. All right, today we're joined by special guest Tom McLeod, is the executive director of Arkive.net. They are building an organization that is collecting physical items and while making them available to the world through a distributed museum. We really get into some of the thesis and ideas behind this. I think you'll see that it is very compelling. It's an interesting idea that sort of builds off maybe some of the NFT collectives and funds that have been created, but takes it in a new and interesting way. We spent a bunch of time talking about building useful tools for DAOs and how those will most likely sort of emerge from projects like Arkive solving their own problems. And we also talked a bunch about the future of governance and the roadmap that they're on. Tom is, a multiple time successful founder, a very, very thoughtful human being, and you can really tell the passion he has for this project. And of course, they've recently announced a wonderful fundraising round, so they're off to the races. I think there's a lot of insight here for DAO builders and for folks that are maybe interested in the broader NFT or collection space as well. So let's jump into it. Tom, welcome to Club.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
I love just jumping in on this. We're on a time crunch today. We don't need to make sure that no children are left out in the cold or the heat today. But I was really excited when you agreed to hop on because many people have been talking about Arkive for the last little while. I've definitely been following some of the stuff online, but it seems as if you've just sort of had this resurgent or maybe like the grand unveil, at least come back onto my radar. And as soon as you start poking around, it's a very simple concept, and yet I think it has like a ton of interesting directions I think it can go. And so I'm stoked to dive into that with you. But maybe just to start, if you want to just introduce yourself and what you're working on.
Sure. I'm Tom McLeod. I'm the co-founder. We're using weird titles because it's sort of DAO structure and everything. I'm the executive director, which kind of mimics more closely the way a museum would follow things. So I'm the executive director here at Arkive. And I guess this is, I don't know if we call this a company, but if it's a company, this is my 5th one. So I've been around for a little while trying these different things, and it's been a heck of a ride.
Amazing. So I want to go there in a second, but what's sort of the high level description of Arkive?
It all kind of started with this question, which was, what if the internet, what if the world could curate the Smithsonian? What would that look like? What if the internet bought the Smithsonian? All these different pieces tying to this idea of curation and archiving and museums and what is culture and how do we catalog that and how could or should that evolve going forward. And so Arkive is pretty simply a group of people coming together to build functionally a down-up museum where the community itself, the people who would be members or attend or participate or visit a traditional museum, actually get to take part in what the collections of the museum are. And what does that look like? What does it look like when a bunch of people get together and they are interested in various different things, but have a really strong focus on what impact matters and how do you put something against it? So that's what we're building.
Yeah, so to dive in on that, but I'm kind of curious, if this is your 5th company / organization / new DAO, I'm curious it sounds like you've had some success in the traditional world and in building companies. And yet here you are doing a DAO. Like what went into that decision and why are you doing it this way versus the way that you've sort of proven your success in the past?
So I'll say regardless of what you start or the medium that you want to start it in, you kind of have to be absurdly, maybe irrationally passionate about starting something, right? So I think the through line between every company was whenever the ideas started to coalesce, I either felt like they had to exist to a point where I wouldn't really be able to sleep without their existence. I needed them to exist, so they were trying to solve a problem or a thing that was just in my way. And I was like, if it's in my way, it might be in other people's ways. Or in this case, it's kind of a perfect storm of maybe my last 10, 12 years of work and personal and professional crossover, right? It's all these things that I really care about and have actually built I'd say a company's reputation, time, energy, effort, education in. And so for this, it was like, I've never actually felt this way before with a company, but it was this, if this becomes the last thing I do, regardless of how an exit looks or monetary compensation for my time and or others and investors, I hope it's still around. Like I want to be functionally running or a part of this in the next, at 55, 60, 70. I just want this to exist the same way I want the Smithsonian to exist or the Louvre or the MoMA. I want to put something out there that I was a part of. So this one is it's closer to a calling than a company.
I love that answer. I often think the most exciting DAOs are institutions or would be seen as institutions rather than and companies or like the evolutions of companies. And I mean, I very much feel the same way about C Club. I go like, what the heck else would I even do in the world? Really? Like this is,
right.
Just like it consumes my entire being and in a way that is both nourishing and exhausting, but net far more nourishing than anything else on a day-to-day basis.
I feel that deeply.
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know if I would have put it that way. I think it's sort of the meme of, the Smithsonian. Like that's very much, you can sort of trace an institution and a museum as an institution.
Museums do a lot, right? So, museums are obviously institutions. They literally are institutions. Historically, they've been physical spaces, right? So they tend to be a hub of physical culture and creativity in a city. They're massive signs of soft power. So they tend to show off the creative force of a nation or a city or a town or a community. They're also like physical representations of hard power often, right? So, a British museum is full of the sort of broad-based spoils of imperialism and conquest. So, I mean, these museums really do stand out in different levels of institution beyond just the way, a ballpark does, which also has some of those things, but not quite all of them at once. And then they also tend to be gathering spaces for thinking and thought and conversation. I believe when you look at all of those things we just described, DAO structuring, Web3 broadly, the interoperability of crypto, the sort of moments of technology that we're seeing right now, a lot of convergence, even some net benefits potentially of a post-pandemic world, or we might still be in it currently, but of people restructuring and relocating, you're going to have to look for those things a little differently. You might not necessarily live near one of those hubs, but why can't you still be a part of it? And a lot of those things were tugging at me and are discussed daily in the community is like, what does it look like for things to be out in the world? And if you remove that first maybe constraint, that physical location constraint, you suddenly have a very new paradigm for what does it look like to participate in a museum or even visit it. We're hoping to reshape and do different things around that consistently. That's the game plan.
You hear many people talking about something similar to that and use the word metaverse.
Sure.
I think drastically overused right now, or at least not super well defined. And yet I think if we think about where their meaningful metaverse experiences are happening, it's happening in maybe video podcasts like this or Discord rooms or Zooms or whatever. I'm curious what your sort of thoughts are. Like, is this of the same sort of theme? Do you see it meaningfully different?
So I think we have two layers here, right? So we are dealing in physical items, right? And I think that is both a thing that Web3, crypto, communities, convergence, the speed that you can do these things come together faster. So the fact that you can pool capital quickly, that you can work across borders, that we're all functionally using the same sort of payment systems, same voting systems, you can really get together and do things and organize very quickly without necessarily having to figure out where the vans and trucks go right out of the gate. You can kind of solve that on the other side. Where there is a hardship there is, where is it located? Without the constraints, with limitless possibilities, you might actually lose something in that translation. And so where I think of it is we have this sort of mandate where potentially a traditional museum might have, 20% of their objects on display at the museum and 80% in warehouses or external places that they're no longer visible at any given time. Without having that, we should be able to put 100% of the stuff out in the world. So one of the things we're working on is every object that we collect, we're working on a partnership with potentially other museums, with public-private spaces, with nonprofits, with facilities that can actually put it out in the world. So if you've ever been a part of Arkive, you can see the things that you help to curate, help to work on, and we're passionate about. All the conversations, you can see them out in the world. And when I think about the metaverse of it all, I personally think, and this, I don't know if this is a hot take, maybe I should tweet more, but I think like Pokemon Go is the most successful metaverse thing ever. And no one really gives it a ton of credit. But it basically is a whole other layer on top of reality, that a whole other world is existing. You can participate. There's another community. Multiple people could stand in the same place and not actually have any interaction on the physical side, but be fully connected in this metaverse layer. And when we think about what does a decentralized museum look like beyond the tokenomics or the tokens themselves or NFTs or anything in sort of the decentralized nature of crypto, the distribution of the objects can also be decentralized. So you could sit here and sort of say, what would it look like if I landed in Oslo, or I landed in Jeddah, or I landed in Atlanta, and I opened up the Arkive app and I saw all the art and objects and items that were in that area curated by the community are now out in that room, and I could go see them, just like I might go find a Pokemon, I might go find a Charizard, I might go find a Pikachu. We're looking at it that way. And when we think about how the metaverse can play into this, it's this level of, you can still discover these objects, you could experience them without necessarily being there, but potentially also being there unlocks another thing where now you're in front of it and you can take a picture and learn about it and add your contribution to the permanent blockchain record of it. So we're thinking about all these different ways to tie these things together. I do think they should be tied closer than people are doing. I think most people are confusing metaverse with like VR, like everything has to be a whole nother place. Like, oh, now, and I actually think there's all different levels of like AR, VR, metaverse, other layers on top of things, little different dimensional pockets where you're experiencing things differently. I think it's a broad term that you can tie a lot of these things together, and it should be about maximizing experience, because at the end of the day, almost every product, service, community is tied to experiencing something, right?
I'm really interested in sort of like this landscape, because it feels like what you're building is something that, you know, if looked at in different ways, kind of takes different shapes, right? So use the museum as an example, but maybe the closest organization that sort of seemed relevant here, it might be like an NFT collector DAO, right? Like, so they say Flamingo DAO, right? Is that a fair comparison, or like, you know, what are the meaningful differences that you're seeing there?
Sure. I mean, in the first pitch deck, I think one of the things they were a triggering point, not in the triggered sense of it all, but in the application of pressure, where I saw Pleaser and Flamingo and folks mimicking a lot of the sort of trappings of the traditional art and collectibles world with the speed of online, right? And the speed that NFTs and stuff were moving at that time, right? So you're seeing a group buy, you're seeing people come together, individuals working on behalf of the overall org to maybe sweep the floor on a project that they're a part of. You're seeing these things come together, and because it's on chain, you can just open up Nansen and kind of figure out what's going on. It's not terribly opaque. It's actually available, which is something that's missing from maybe the overall art market. But when you see what that's happening and you see how these are coming together and people carrying, collecting, and curating because they believe both in value and impact of what they're working on, I think it would be impossible to not sort of tip my hat or think that that was a part of it. I'd say the big differentiation point is, you know, I think largely we're less interested out of the gate in the pure financialization of it all. It's broadly like, if you're building out the Louvre, the first thing you thought about wasn't necessarily, was this art of French Renaissance painting the most valuable one? It's the one that was the most symbolic, the most impactful, that probably meant the most to the times in the moment when it was created. And we're looking somewhat similarly. I do believe from the financial aspect, as we start to tie those levers in, you'll be rewarded because of that, because impact over time and looking long actually does create reward. So for us, it's, and the fact that we have significantly longer data. So if you're working on collectibles, vintage cars, fine art, we're looking at markets that, while still rapidly moving and things change hands, there's provenance over tens, if not hundreds of years, right? So I think we have a slightly longer time frame by which we can understand those. But the core functionality of people coming together, voting, collecting, and hoping to create value for each other through that process, and that overarching sense of community that comes from that, is definitely, you know, right there. And I respect the hell out of all those folks.
Yeah, it seems as if there's sort of like a, you know, the scale of community for something in Arkive could be much greater than the scale of community in something like Flamingo. Like and in fact, maybe that's where we should get to next, because I'm making a whole bunch of assumptions here without fully understanding the shape of it. Yeah, let's dive in a little bit to like the shape of Arkive, the organization that you're building there, and the mechanisms that you're using to sort of, well, ultimately, I guess, make decisions and drive the value that you're trying to drive. So can we start maybe at like the highest level? What is Arkive made up from an operational standpoint? And then maybe we can dive into some of the specific ways that you guys make decisions.
Totally. So at the top, you know, you have a core team of individuals that started as just people in a Discord that I was like, pinging. Are you interested in this? Does this seem fun? I saw you tweet about collectibles. I know you're interested in this type of stuff. A few folks I'd worked with at various companies in the past on product design, et cetera, that all were kind of unified in like, I think you all are long thinkers, and this is the type of project that's going to require that. That certainly happened if you're looking at a tech stack. It certainly happened in Discord, where I think a lot of these things have happened over the past 2 years. I would say we realized and have realized pretty quickly that we've had to start to build out our own tooling, at the very least in an online sense. So voting doesn't happen in Discord. We have something called the Atrium, which is a custom product that we've started to build out for voting that showcases every item, that gives you facts and information, multimedia about every object, starts to tie it together, and is evolving rapidly to add in the engagement metrics around individuals and objects. So that's sort of the tooling stack has been that. And then on the back end of that, it's pretty traditional stuff. Everything's in Notion and linear on the coding side. We're definitely building things in a way that isn't reinventing the wheel of that on the process side. But when we look at voting, I think a few things came together early. One was every time you sort of add an individual, you add a lot of value, but you also add more noise. And that's not noise in a bad way. It's just more noise. Your signal to noise ratio starts to change. And similar to if you said, hey, every person in America could get voted on to be the president next week, it would be impossible to really get any consensus. No one would respect anyone. You have to have some systems by which you get to a degree of choice that can be maxed enough to find something. We realized early on we needed to at least establish some degree of curation from within the community. So we started asking people who have been curators at fine art institutions, museums, private art collections, and then beyond that, rare book collectors, vintage car folks, rare video game collectors. And we kind of came together and realized the big vote was around the yearly theme. We could start from anything there, and it was worth in getting as much participation as possible in that moment. And that settled on the idea of when technology was a game changer. So year one, everything is tied to this idea that before some facet of this piece that's in here, technology enabled it. And we thought that was a great sort of Genesis project, Genesis collection for a museum that is 100% utilizing new forms of technology for its existence. And then everything beyond that, every month right now, we're curating small curatorial rounds across different themes. Those themes being like sectors. So fine art, watches, sports cards and memorabilia. This one, we're doing one right now on music. Music television is the concept, but it's functionally looking at moments of music history and how those objects tie together. But the through line is still technology. So everything we're suggesting we're working on still is tied to some overarching theme, so that when we go to display this, you'll be able to see a path and why these are all connected and how this happens. I'd say that was another early learning, that once we brought the curator folks in, they were super excited. I think everyone also realized that bringing folks like that in also increases the net learning. So everyone suddenly was learning more, which is a very core part of the community. Is you come in from watches and you learn about cars. You come in from cars and you learn about fine art. You come in from fine art and you learn about vintage video games. And suddenly you're just getting more into the whole process of it. But you realize pretty quickly that museum collections, certainly exhibitions are tied. You can't just, if you were going to present this and you just said, here's a bunch of objects, it's not actually compelling. You have to have these through lines. You have to take real time with it. And so we've been focused on that in the future, when we display these objects together and then maybe they spread back out apart, you'll always understand why they came together. So that's a lot of the learnings we've had. And I'd say a big one will be that as you expand into more folks and more people join the community, I think those sections almost become guilds. So you might actually, you might have a T-shaped individual with a hard focus on like, I care about rare books, and I'm going to have 70% of the weight of my vote is always going to be pushed against the voting side of books, et cetera. And that might be how budgets are described and different things. And then, every guild has its own sort of leadership and members and these different pieces, which becomes kind of awesome. Similar to the way the Smithsonian Institute might look over the American History Museum, the Native American Museum, the African American Museum, the Air and Space Museum. You'll see these sort of guild-like structures within us. But a lot of this is, building a rocket ship in space, which has its, it's fun to go fast, but kind of make sure you keep the oxygen levels high.
Okay, so I'm hearing a few things there that I think are interesting to pull apart. One is confronting the challenge of a large community and trying to create some focus there. And I think that's definitely been thing that is often brought in by founding teams or by sort of a leader in an organization or by sort of like the initial inspiration. But it sounds you need to have sort of an evolution that can exist here. And it also creates this really great place or mechanism for bringing people together, which actually is a big challenge for most of these communities to do at any level of scale, because there's a very different type of engagement that can happen at that sort of meta 1,000-person, I don't know how many people are in a community, but many people there versus the day-to-day operations or the moving of a specific project forward, which would actually really suffer from overwhelm with the number of people that might want to be giving inputs. And so you've sort of designed the structure to solve that to start.
Yeah, I'd say a key part personally is I just really want to be a member. So everything here is like, I don't want to have to do much guidance. The joy of Arkive for me is getting to vote on things. Like, I don't particularly want to be swaying it beyond getting to state my opinions. I want the rails to work because I want to be surprised at things showing up and getting to learn from folks every day. If you're the CEO of a company, you know everything ahead of time. That's actually the least surprising job, is being the CEO. When you get a surprise as a CEO, it's terrible. That's usually the worst surprise. Rarely is the surprise great. It's usually something has gone wrong. It's not like, everything, you know that you're getting acquired before the surprise happens. That's for sure. I look at it like I want to put all the things in place and help with the community and everyone so I can truly just fall back and be a participant. That's the most exciting part of getting the DAO part right, is I just truly want to be a member of the DAO. I want to just go to the greatest museum ever. Like that sounds great. I was at a museum this weekend and I was like, look at all this work. It's impossible to not, now every time I look at a museum. So my degree is actually audio engineering. And this is just to jump back real quick. And one of the hardest parts of being an audio engineer was like all the mystery of music was kind of removed. Mm-hmm. It wasn't as fun necessarily to experience it because I could hear like, I know what I would critically think like, that's what I know what they did to make that snare sound like that. Or, okay, they double mic'd the drums. And I couldn't get out of my head. I would listen to music constantly critically. And now I'm looking at museums and I'm feeling that, how do you think they figured out where to put the dinosaurs in the wing at the Natural History Museum? What went into this? Where did they thought about things? And I'm excited to get back to the point where I can just experience it. And I want to experience Arkive in the same way. I want to just, open up my iPhone, open up Discord and be a part of it. So I will deem it successful for my tenure when, I am fully just getting the emails and pumped to join and flexing my weight only in the fact that I want to participate in conversation.
Okay, so you've given us a bit of a structure of how maybe some decisions are made around collections and themes, etc. How about how new members join? Is there an application process there? Do I need to hold tokens? How are you thinking about that?
So we're pre-token at the moment. We've basically got arkive.net/apply. There's a not substantial, but I would say more than just email and name application right now. We're finding pretty quickly that just having people have to do a little more does a great job of figuring out who really wants to be a part of it. We don't have a full plan exactly for what being in the Discord now will guarantee happens in the future, but there's some degree of assumption that when we do officially create the sort of NFT membership side, being a participant, having already been in the Discord, will certainly lead to Discord access ahead of time, or certainly a pre-mint access, something for having participated for 6 to 7 months right now ahead of that. Our current plan is for that to most likely happen in Q1 of next year, post Art Basel in Miami, where we have a lot of the stuff culminating around events and the objects we're creating right now. So that's what it looks like currently. One of the things we are developing are things we call APs, which are archive points. We're basically same thing, where we're adding all this unique tooling, where we're tracking and incentivizing basically the behaviors that we think help and engage the community. So everything from a GM in GM to, did that wallet vote? Did you join the curatorial call on Monday for the new collection? Did all these, so it's sort of tracking to see, who's really engaged, who's lurking, who's just hoping a token airdrops one day. And I think there's some degree of planning around, as those points become more impactful, they will probably track to voting strength or extra sort of bonus around NFT, membership holder access, things like that. So creating systems that we, I believe, will eventually fully go on chain that right now are kind of flexibly being applied.
Interesting. Those sort of experiments are ones that I'm super interested in. I think I'm on maybe the opposite side of you here and think that that is actually not super helpful in the long term, mostly because it gets gamed so clearly. I remember being a part of some of the early tokenized communities, and I think the early idea was that, we're building more of like an economy, right? And so there's sort of, you want interactivity and engagement to happen. And then even seeing some of the early days in FWB with source cred and even some of the changes they've made there, my broad take is, we need more experiments here, because I don't, my intuition is probably not, well, it's almost always not 100% correct, but I think it starts to you start to layer on all these different incentives that actually complicate your incentive stack more than simplify it. And then there's very clearly things like when I think about Seed Club, some of the things that we want to be really good at is, we want to be able to attract great members, and we want to be able to make decisions on bringing the best projects in. That's kind of the core mechanism we have. And you can imagine that over time, you'd be able to identify people who've done that better or worse, and that would be a very useful metric. But as soon as I start to think about layering on multiple different pieces there, I get very uncomfortable with it. Mostly because I believe we start to play these micro mini games rather than starting to play whatever that macro game is.
Right. So, I came from sort of mobile. I was in mobile gaming for a while back in the 10s. And broadly, gaming, right, has this concept of the meta, right? And I think that's been applied heavily to crypto also. Everyone's always trying to figure out what the meta is vis-a-vis trading strategies. Overall, is it DeFi? Is it NFTs? Is it token swaps? Is it AMM, impermanent loss harvesting? At any given time, people are constantly moving their pile and checking these things. I do think while right now the hitting a blunt object with engagement and saying this is how you're important has negative disincentivization long term because it's not actually creating habit, I do think in specifically the Arkive case where we've been looking at is the natural thing that you're doing, you're joining in such a way where I believe we'll have somewhat higher engagement around the actual act of voting, which historically, when you look at maybe broad-based DAOs, it's very low. It's something like 5 to 15% of token holders vote or participate. And I mostly want to start to see if we can get that engagement up early, pre any financial incentivization, because I do believe if we can get that embedded in the culture, that the people that rise to the top are the individuals who are consistently adding to the value of the community, not just by chatting, but by actually doing the things that will create a long-lasting museum. It'll mean when people join, they'll naturally align with that. And so I think when I look at stuff like an FWB and source cred, the reason I had a lot of source cred started off because I discovered one day that I had talked a ton one month and I got a lot. After that, it truly did become, I'm definitely going to keep talking at some level, right? And in this case, the opportunities aren't quite the same. So we would never do it tied to volume. It's sort of like true participation. Did you show up? If you're in this community and you don't vote for the acquisitions, either we've messed up or you've messed up because you said you wanted to do it. But either way, we should track that. One of our investors, actually, Nate Bosshard from Offline, pinged me today and was saying that he actually wants a pass button on the voting. He's like, I want to be able to vote that I'm not into the things that are being presented this time, but I still want to vote. He's like, I want to show that I'm engaging. And he's like, currently my only solution for it is abstentia. And abstentia is not great. He's like, I'm participating. I listened. I care about this a lot. I actually want to cast a vote for nothing. So those types of things are already starting to think about how we would do that. And I think traditionally, if you're voting for president or school board committee, you wouldn't vote, I pass on both of these people. If you went into the booth, you're making a thing. In this case, we want to have that object because we think it's important that when you tie these things to a public record, you can show your attendance through something. So that's just the first level where I think we can actually incentivize that behavior because you might just abstain if it wasn't going on kind of the record that you abstained. Now that's a user experience lever that's changing. So we'll see. All of this is due to iterate. Companies are evolutions, and I think DAOs are going to be micro revolutions every 2 weeks or so.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's finding the appropriate mechanisms to track, and the only way to really find that is to have a hypothesis and start pushing it. And I do think it's very smart to do it prior to any sort of financial or token happening there, because that is, I think, really where the weird incentives start to play out. Yeah, there's enough sort of ambiguity, I guess, but man, it's crazy what people will do to get into discords and try to game the system, man. It's Kind of crazy. Okay, so I guess I'm curious now about you guys have just announced a funding round. We brought in some capital, which I'm assuming is being used to sort of get you started here. How do you sort of see the value flow here? Are you buying stuff with that? Is this to acquire your first pieces? Is this cash that's come in, or give us the big picture there?
It's twofold, right? So a part of it is fully allocated to acquiring the early items. I think we hit early on, we were like, we can do this one of two ways. We can NFT first, value second, raise all the capital that way and tell people what we're gonna do, and maybe they support us by joining. I personally felt like in this situation, this was my pitch to the overall community, that doing that would bring in people who weren't necessarily aligned with the long term. They were very much aligned with the short term potentiality. And that just doesn't work for an institution with the sort of goals that we were putting out. And that it's better to put it on us. If we think we're going to build this, let's show and prove. And while that might mean we have to raise capital and, venture is expensive if you think of it from what you believe something could be worth in the future versus what it's worth today versus what you're going to give up for that. It's expensive to say we're going to raise venture capital to apply to acquire some works of fine art and use that not for necessarily burn and growth. So part of it was, but we believe that would actually lead to a better output at the end. So that was one side. And then we also were coming from a place where I was like, I think a lot of people I think there's some people who are massively gaming DAOs and they're figuring out how to make 6-figure a year salaries off of source cred and 5 jobs and sitting and rapidly switching between discords. And I think there's a lot of people who are getting taken advantage of on the other side, while they're actually kind of working for free with skill sets that they've spent decades honing. And I didn't want to put people in either out of the gate. I was like, we don't have a token. We don't have a way to pay you with that side. And I want to make sure that we can bring in tier 1 A-level people, that are incentivized to build this and also can go home at night and take a rest, not having to work 4 other night discords, right? So that's kind of where it came from for us, is that this was a means to making the strongest foundation on both the collection itself and the core team structuring that gets us enough time to take a real shot. And personally, this is my 3rd crypto bear market. I've been around for a while. I think my first Bitcoin purchase is like 2013. I'm not new to watching net worths jump and drop. And I was like, we need to backstop the quality of this idea against the fluctuations in the market while we're potentially building out something that could maybe be a port in the storm for those fluctuations in the future. If you think about the value of bridging offline tier 1 museum level assets on chain, right? So that was the thought process here. And the mandate we worked under was everyone got the same pitch. I think this is a big idea. It's relatively binary. Either we're gonna build a museum and it's gonna work, or this is kind of a boom or bust moment. I also don't think this is series A, B, C, D, E. I think this is one round gets us there, gets us enough runway. There's probably one more opportunity ahead of NFT drop, et cetera, to be a participant. And then it's out into the world. And if that's the case, you got to kind of go all in. And that's where everyone's been aligned here. And it's very hard. I don't have the ego nor the heart, which sounds overly soft, to tell people to risk it all on a 2 years of maybes. At least everyone knows they have got 2+ years of steady state employment, but let's do the damn thing. And that's kind of where we came from on this.
Yeah, I'm so over this idea of raising capital is somehow bad for DAOs or that, I think it's very true. And I think you said it well, venture is expensive and we do have new tools that exist. And I think NFTs and crowdfunds that are really exciting for so many projects in many ways. But there's just so much short-termism in this space. And I'm a big believer in compounding value over time. I think Warren Buffett says it best. And, it's the most powerful thing on the planet or in the universe. And yet we kind of, in very unintentional ways, I think, just sort of create different type of incentives that sort of play against it. And so the fact that you have to even explain any of your reasoning behind this, I think is actually just seen as to me, it's just kind of one of the frustrations about the space. Big ideas, give us the runway to go execute on it. One of the places where it actually does hit sort of the ground is thinking through what is the actual org structure around it? Because since in many ways, raising capital can actually create sort of 2 separate entities, right? Where you have your equity holders and then you have your token holders. And, there's many ways that teams are trying to bridge that. There truly isn't the easiest sort of mechanism to do that on chain right now. So I'm curious how you guys have thought about that. Are those 2 separate groups or are they one and the same?
Yeah, so it's clear part of that 24 to 36 months of runway we have right now is there's a triangle of structuring that has to happen here. There's sort of legal entity structuring. How does that work? Where is value actually captured? What entity holds the ENIAC patent? Is that an Inc? Is that a trust? Where does that locate? Is that in Delaware? Is that in BVI? Is that in Singapore? Is that in Switzerland? So there's thoughts on those things. Then there's, how do you bring in inbound? Is the museum a nonprofit? We've gone down a road. Like, is this truly a museum? Can we work out a way that people can opportunistically put stuff in the system? Who manages the nonprofit? Oh, could that be, is that what the Archive Exploration, the Inc is? How do they capture value from those? And then, so there's the off-world part, which again, I think the 10 years of raw crypto anarchist side needs to exist, but it also will slowly get tempered with reality, and we'll get to a place that's closer to where they started and where everyone started over here than when it started. There will eventually be something between those two, and that's kind of where you've got to kind of play the line. So there's that side, just the structuring. And then I think there's just going to be evolutions in governance, period, right? So I think historically being the last 48 months of life, governance has been a token comes out, and that token means you get to vote, and maybe one venture firm controls 30% of the token or something, and that's okay because they've given their voting rights to MIT blockchain club or something, right? Like, they're doing all these things to sort of assuage where's value. And I do think one of the things we're looking at is using the correct technology for the piece that you're trying to establish. And so the value of the actual underlying assets and pieces might come through a token, but that doesn't necessarily mean the token controls the curation. NFT membership, where you actually have paid to be a member and want to be a part of this and events and things, the NFTs could truly be the vote for the actual collection, right? So now you're separating a little bit of like, we want to be here versus we paid to be here, from a differentiation point of, the value of my NFT is that I get to vote and join and go to events and be a part of this and see these things. And that doesn't mean that couldn't earn money. Maybe the way you earn money from the NFT is that the DAO itself earns money and you get a cut directly to the wallet that holds it, which is a dividend, not a capital gains. There's so many ways to structure this now that I think it's been so young and so new thinking about these that we just defaulted to one token to rule them all and then tried to shoehorn everything. And in a larger system of network, you have all different types of ways to sort of be an employee, to be a customer, to be a shareholder, to be a board advisor, to be all these different pieces. I think those things are all going to get structured out, and we're looking at all of those. And again, the venture side was, we want to buy the time to do it right, because if I want to do this, like I said in the beginning, till I'm 65, we got to set some of these things up early and right. And that means not just bonding a quick smart contract and launching a token.
I mean, the complications in what you sort of laid out there are, for folks who maybe haven't had to dive into the nuance, all this sort of stuff, are driven in large part by the lack of regulatory clarity that exists here. And so even in your answer there, it's very apparent that you've sort of been down a bunch of roads and are sort of, there's this whole host of different org structures and ownership structures and governance structures. I sort of hold two things to be true. One, like, a simple token model is preferred whenever possible. And then two, we think that token-weighted governance, or one token equals governance, is a simple model. But in fact, it actually has so many different pieces bundled into it that adds complexity in a different part of the stack. And so it's very, very imperfect right now. And yeah, excited to see the experiments.
I think what people miss, and I think this is where the market will mature for sure on every front, from DeFi to NFTs to just sort of standard token trading, is we're now getting to the point where I think we can start to map sort of second order effects, which have been established in larger technology now for a while. You can sort of figure out, what happens when you turn off a TCP stack or something. Like when you do, you can start, these things have happened now enough that people can guess it. And we're just starting to see, it turns out if you give full control over to something, you can get front run. I learned a lot from Constitution DAO, right? If you give your community something, you can get removed as the person who founded it. That's happened, to a couple DAOs we've seen where people are like, people might vote completely with their self-interest. They might do a bunch of debt to buy token for a moment just to swing a vote and then sell it again and tank the stock. Like, there's so many things that happen here that I think people are now going to start to move into, we really need to put these systems in place in a way that we can understand a little bit more what happens and probably put in buffers for what occurs. And I think that's good. I think that's maturity. And then from the regulation standpoint, I mean, I've always been on the some degree of people want to know how to play ball. Like, you want to know the rules. If you went on a basketball court and someone just gave you a ball and put two nets up, you'd probably throw the ball in the net. You'd figure that out. But everything else would be chaos for a very long time. And like, I think right now we're like, people gave us some balls and put up some nets, and we've been throwing it in, and turns out a lot of people liked it, but it's not the NBA. It's like, we don't have all the, we need some degree of refs. People argue about refs, but the sport would be worse without it, right? And so I think that's obviously coming. I hope we don't overcorrect. I hope that doesn't turn into a large distraction. I think there's a lot of things that could do that, but largely, hopefully with enough time, we can get things aligned in a way that things can still move forward with just a little more oversight. But you do need it, because you can't attract real builders. Sounds like I'm saying people in the past haven't been real builders, but when I say real builders in this case, real builders want to know what their materials are and what they can do with them. They want to know what's up to code, why this will stay up. And I think if we want to get the best people in the world into the space to continue to build, they just want to know, can I run with the ball when I shoot it, or do I have to dribble it?
How do you feel about elbows?
Can I throw elbows or not? If I can throw elbows, I'm probably throwing them.
Yeah.
But if I can't throw elbows, then I got to figure out something else. But, at least let me know what I can do.
Yeah, I love that analogy and totally on board. I think there's a degree of risk that anybody's taken building in this space right now that is very much a disincentive to many other folks who could be adding an immense amount of value in the space, but just doesn't make sense from the math at the point of view. So,
someone once asked me, he's like, who's definitely making money in crypto every day? And I was like, it's lawyers.
Oh, the lawyers. The lawyers. Good God.
The only person I'm sure every single day is collecting some sort of gains from both venture and crypto earnings are lawyers right now. And that's fine. They need to exist, but they're definitely making capital.
Yeah, it's so much money for like very little clarity, which is like absurd. Anyways, we don't need to go down, like that's a whole other podcast where we can talk about that. Thank you to our lawyers, who I love dearly, and hope you continue to work hard for us.
Yes, please call me back tonight.
Yes. So early on in our conversation, you'd mentioned building some specific tools. And, I think I've been through the work we do at Seed Club and through our venture team, we start to see a lot of deals coming through. And I have this like big aversion to what I call sort of the all-in-one DAO platform, which is, I think, like looking at, like, it looks maybe more like a Facebook group or a Patreon account where you're adding tokens on top of it. And everybody's going to come and play in my world versus, what we're building at Seed Club. And very clearly what you're building at Arkive is sort of like, how can we pull these composable tools and ideas together and bring them together and innovate and create something big and world transformational? I think sort of part of that thesis is that the actual DAO tools, the very useful DAO tools, are going to be built by the DAOs themselves that are trying to go solve their project themselves. I wonder if you can maybe comment on that, and like, where else are you sort of seeing the need to go build things yourselves?
I don't know if it's unique, because it's come up with a few other sort of DAO folks that I've talked to at senior levels in their communities or doing them full time. But I'd say a big one for us specifically is Arkive is really moment based. There's high spikes of moments. So and that moment can tie to sort of value of being a participant. And those moments might come with a really incredible discussion that happens at 3 a.m. Pacific time, which has ruled out almost all of a group of people from being able to participate. But the team in Europe is like super engaged. Something amazing has happened. And by the time everyone wakes up, enough has happened, more things have gone on, and you've just lost it. It's just gone. You can pin it. No one's, these things happen. And the synchronous nature by which everything has kind of been forced into right now, which is more based on the fact that crypto is this kind of like 24/7 casino. So being synchronous was a superpower when you're day trading. There's no question why everyone joined these things. It was built around this like streaming video games and streaming money kind of worked together. But in this case, when you're trying to actually work with a community, you find that you need to capture both the moments and not you don't want to lose the serendipity of sync. And so for us, we're starting to look at this hybrid model where things are happening in this synchronous, but you can highlight a whole chunk of messages and make them a media package that moves into an async feed. And what does that look like? So you kind of have a Reddit-like interface on the right side, a sync interface in the middle. So suddenly news, posts, articles, hey, curation called today. That was great. When you show up at an hour, you can only check in an hour a day. You have 4 other jobs, or you're doing your life, or you're parenting your kids, whatever's going on. When you check in, you didn't miss the magic. It was still brought there for you, which means the cultural things that happen stick around. So when a new meme is created or new slang or that isn't lost. You didn't miss the inside joke because you didn't happen to be around when it was made. It got kind of pushed into a level of hierarchy that means, oh, this should be async, like this matters. So one of the things we're starting to work on is like, how do you do that? And the way I feel like people have done that so far has been just like digests. It's like an email digest. And I don't think that goes far enough. You almost need a full Reddit tagged to a sync. And we're starting to look at what that looks like. So we're building some of those things internally into that Atrium piece of software, which has kind of the voting and the points and everything. I think we'll open that up, but we want other people to use it. But it's going to for sure be built to solve our needs first and then kind of roll out into, does this solve other people's problems? And I think it's going to be tricky to get a sales pitch from someone that gives me click up for DAOs. And I'm going to be like, well, I don't need 90% of the stuff you're saying. And the two things you do kind of mediocre. I'd rather just do the things we need and not have all this confusing bloat. So we'll see how it all tracks, but I firmly believe that.
I'm pretty on board with that. I think it's interesting to me to see what VCs are backing in this space, because I feel like that it just makes it very clear which ones haven't been in an operational role in a DAO. Yeah, it was so interesting. We're building we call it sort of our network tool, which is something very similar on the communication front. How do we support our founders incredibly effectively and create this many-to-many connections? Discord doesn't do it. Maybe the closest thing is maybe Y Combinator's Bookface, but I think we have some interesting things to do. And then it sounds like the other tool you guys have built was around more of or piece of Atrium is building like how decisions are made. And we're in the same boat where we have a couple times a year, we have a whole bunch of information that we need to make available to our club token holders, and they help decide which projects get in. But there's just a massive amount of information asymmetry that exists. And so how do we actually structure voting mechanisms that actually start to reduce that distance and also provide the right type of engagement for our club token holders to make decisions? So interesting to see that we sort of pulling at similar threads in probably a bit different ways.
I'll tell you, if someone would just build a wallet address to email relay where no one knew either side, I think it would massively change the communication landscape of DAOs. So people are obviously trying to do fully on chain right now, right? XMTP, there's people doing it on Solana, a few other places where it's like, wallet to wallet messaging. But honestly, if you just give me a website where I anonymously put in my wallet address and my email, and you could now just go there and send it, and it worked as a relay, I think we would increase DAO engagement because people still use email. Like, it still exists. This is real stuff. How does this go? So
if you're working on that, Tom and I want to back it. C Club Ventures is interested. Tom needs it today, so let us know.
Arkive will jump on board wherever possible for you.
Amazing, Tom. Normally I like to wind down these conversations some bit, but that was just pure value for me, at least right up until the very end. So I want to thank you for dedicating some of your time in the evening here to chat with us. Very exciting project. I think there's, if you're building a DAO or a community right now, listening to Tom here, I think it's pretty clear that there's a ton of innovation happening in this community. It's worthwhile getting in there, poking around to see how they're doing things, and why not be a part of building the Internet's Museum? It sounds like a pretty big adventure that I'm going to be joining here pretty shortly. So is there any sort of final words or direction you'd like to give our listeners?
I think all are welcome. It's arkive.net/apply. It's still early, and this is about as early as it gets for us. But, we raised with the commitment to building something real, and you join and you listen, and everyone is excited to be there, and we'd love to have you. So come on, come join. Let's build a museum.
Yep.
Literally, what's more fun? Like, it's about as fun as it gets.
I mean, we could talk forever, but go check out what they're collecting. Like, there's some really, really interesting narratives being driven there that you can have a look at arkive.net. So Tom, appreciate your time, man. And we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.